Good evening. I am Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Journeys. Lady next to me is Dr. Michelle Asantewa. Michelle Yaa Asantewa actually was born in Guyana in 1969. At age 10, she migrated to the UK to reunite with her mother. Her interest in Africa, African spiritual practices and cultural identity prompted her to do a PhD on the Guyanese Komfa ritual. She formerly lectured in English literature, editing and creative writing at London Metropolitan University, and currently facilitates a range of writing workshops as an independent scholar. Dr. Asantewa, good evening and welcome to CWS Journeys.
Good evening, good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
You're quite welcome. Is it possible for you to move a little bit to your right so we can get you fitting? Yes, that's good. Let me start by asking you, what is usually accurate about the way those close to you describe you?
Could you say that again, please?
What is usually accurate about the way those close to you describe you?
Oh, what is usually accurate about the way those close to me describe me? What's accurate? Oh, difficult question.
Well, how would you describe yourself then? Let's try it that way.
How would I describe myself? Straight, as you see me, as I am. I don't like. I just like to be straight, just tell it like it is, and I suppose that's how I would most describe myself.
Growing up in Guyana,
Yeah?
you grew up in Guyana until you were 9, right? And you left at 10.
Yes, I left at 10.
What was life like? Tell us a little bit about your life growing up in Guyana at age 9.
I suppose I don't remember much of school growing up in Guyana, but I remember things like I remember playing in the rain. I remember we lived in Linden on this hill top, and I remember enjoying when it rained and the sand on that hill, and a kind of sense of like sort of freedom. But then I was a child, so I would have felt free. And at the same time, we were quite poor, and being aware that you were poor, even though you didn't know what the alternative was. Or somewhere I lived in Georgetown, but after my mum left, we moved to Linden to live with my cousins. So you just kind of, there's a certain sensitivity that I remember having, an acute kind of sensitivity about things like looking at adults, observing them, and just feeling at the same time you were. I was expectant as well, because later on I realized that the people that I was living with, they were my family, but I had another family. I initially thought my auntie was my mother. Then I realized that my mother was living in the UK, and so it was a curious time. But at the same time, I did feel a freedom.
Mm-hmm. So the following year at 10, you migrated to the UK to connect with your mother. What was that like for you? Was there a cultural shock? And explain that to us.
Yeah, there was definitely a cultural shock, but also a maternal kind of, or there was a shock certainly with my mum, because I had some issues with my mum when I came as well. So there was the cultural shock of having to navigate your way in this different space, where when you went to school, you were teased because of your accent, and not just by the students, but the teachers as well were just always on my case about my accent. So I always felt like there was this need to be trying to fit in Um, so yeah, on my school reports, it was always, she still has an accent. She still has a strong accent. And getting into a lot of arguments about my accents or about my difference with other African young people or black people. I got into a lot of tussles, fights, having to defend myself. So I remember that.
I mean, I'm curious about that. Here, not only being teased by teased by students, that's one thing, but being teased by teachers, especially for your accent, and then difference is this thing that sort of got magnified for you. Fast forward to what you know now and who you are with the research that you have done. When you look back on how difference was magnified for you or made you felt as though something was wrong with you, what is going through your mind? How have you reconciled or how have you dealt with that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I dealt with that by rebelling.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that one of the things I didn't say when I was younger in Guyana was that I believed I was quite shy. And when I came to the UK, I think that shyness just went because of this needing to defend oneself. So as part of that defense and through school life, I think I became a bit of a clown and didn't take myself seriously or felt that I wasn't taken seriously anyway. So I did a lot of messing around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
In those school years, just probably attention seeking from whether it's from family, my mom, or from the teachers, from the other students and so on. So I think I transferred that sense of difference into, well, look at me, I can be cool, I can be funny, I can just not be clever, I can be, so that was a strategy. It took me a long time to realize that was what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly has helped shape my understanding of young people and teaching young people or mentoring young people as I do, where I see those, how they kind of play up, how they react to a personhood and a sense of themselves when challenged.
So you grew up with your aunt, thought your aunt was your mom. Was your aunt was she the primary female sort of role model for you? I guess what I'm trying to get at, were there other women in your life that made an impact in you and helped to shape this woman you've become today?
Were we talking up until the point when I came to?
Yes. Before you left Guyana,
before I left Guyana, I would say the central figure that I wasn't really totally conscious was actually shaping me in some way, because that I think was happening on a subconscious or on a spiritual level, was actually my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't live with my grandmother. We used to go to visit my grandmother during the summer holidays. And my mother had instructed my aunt that whenever it was the holidays, that we should go to the country to see my grandparents and to stay with them. But I didn't quite realize how much that elder was shaping me, or how much her nurturing I kind of was lapping up or needed. But there were other women. My cousins. I was one of the youngest in the clan of extended family, and so I had elder cousins. I had a really big cousin who was like much older than us. So there was her, and I remember really admiring her and looking up to her, and so on. My auntie, Auntie Pauline. And then Auntie Winnie, who's my mother's sister. But I think if I was to really say the elder that had the sway in my life more a subconscious and spiritual level is my grandmother.
Your grandmother. So that's your mother's mother or your father's mother?
My mother's mother.
Your mother's mother. Why do you think it was so important to your mother that you spend time in the country with your grandmother on vacations? Why do you think? Why do you think so? I mean, I'm not asking you through the lens of a 9-year-old, but I'm asking you through the lens of Dr. Asantewa. Knowing what you know now, why do you think that was so important to her?
I think that was probably important for my mum because she knew that the home we had, which was her sister, my mum's a twin, it was her twin sister, she knew that home was actually quite, there were a lot of them there. And I think she wanted us to have a different experience, to not always be in the in Linden, and I think I don't know. I think she probably thought that we could just have a different experience away from Linden and in the country where it's a lot freer, and we could just be ourselves and just relax and whatever. I actually got to ask her that.
What is the fondest memory you have of that time before you left Guyana?
That's exactly it. My fondest memories before I left Guyana was when I used to go those holidays to country. It took forever in my childhood mind, and actually did take forever, but took quite a long time to get from Linden to the country. And we used to go as my big sister, and the journey just seemed like it was so long, but then we would eventually arrive, and it would just be like you were in a space of love. You were in a territory of love, because as soon as we arrived, and we'd arrive at night, and it was dark. There's no street lights. There's still no street lights, and there was a shop where it was a family member who sold hot tennis rolls. And I always remember, the next day we would go to the shop and he'd give us the tennis rolls. Other than that, having the love of both grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather, and us, the smell of the countryside. I love the countryside air. I still love that smell when you go into the country. So as soon as you hit once you crossed over into the Abari, you knew you were in this different place, and it was just warm, and it was just nurturing. So I think that's my fondest memory of Guyana.
Do you recall any special words of wisdom from any of these women? And I mean your aunts, your mother, your grandmother, that still resonate with you today?
Any special words of wisdom? Not really, because I was one of the youngest. I think the communication, communication was more like you were just in the space, you just felt them, but they never really directed, they never really said anything to you. I mean, it only later on when I came here, I suppose I can remember my mum saying things like, taking your education, and because when I was at school, the early part of schooling, I had white girlfriends. Most of my friends were white, and my mum used to always try to say to me that it's good that you have these friends, but remember that for you things are going to be a little bit harder. She was talking about privilege and racism and so forth, but I wasn't really that focused on all of that. And she said, so you're going to have to try a bit harder and make sure you get your education. That I remember my mum particularly stressing.
Wisdom, huh?
Sorry?
Wisdom, I said.
Yeah, wisdom.
Wisdom. Tell us about your first steps in writing.
My first,
steps in writing. When did you first start writing? That for as far as you can remember. I'm talking about writing creatively.
I first started writing at school. Um, at school, like I'm trying to think, because obviously we did English, and we would have to write little stories for, for English. But then I used to do this thing where I would write like a serial. I would write little, like it was a series, and I would read it to my friends every day. So I'd write a little bit, and they would get the next installment the next day, and so on. So I think that was what nurtured my kind of desire for writing. But I didn't really think I was gonna be a writer. There was no plan to do that. I just kind of enjoyed making up stories, and then I suppose it was an extension of part of the trying to be cool, trying to be, popular or whatever. So I would just make these stories up, so then I could read it to them, and they just seemed to love the stories. So yeah, I'd say when I was a teenager, about 14, 15 was when I used to write. But it's obviously it started off with school, having to do it, and then just doing my own sideline ones, which I've still got some of, by the way. Which is
really,
like,
what was your favorite thing to write on?
Sorry?
What was your favorite thing to write about?
Oh God, like cheesy stuff, like to do with love. Then there was always the dark element to them. They were love, but they weren't quite. There was always something a bit dark in the corner. I never seemed to trust, like the superficial romances and things like that. So I always seemed to add these elements of mystery and intrigue in them.
So you have written 3 books, including Guyanese Komfa, your PhD thesis. But before we get into Guyana Komfa, let's talk a little bit about the other 2 books. The first one, which of the 2 is that? And why did you write it?
The first one, Mamalou Tales.
Mm-hmm.
Mamalou Tales. Why did I write that book? That book was written out of sheer, what can I say, a necessity, born of a time when, because my mother was continuously telling me these stories, over and over again, she'd just tell the same stories, and then we just started calling them Mamalou Tales. It was just a natural thing. She's just telling the stories that she knew about village life and so on. And then I thought, well, I'd set up this publishing company with my partner, and we published my first novel through it, and first collection of poems. And then we were thinking, okay, well, what we'll do next is we'll do Mamalou Tales. And it will just be about these folk tales that my mum tells over and over again. But then in the process of doing that, I kind of read the story or my mum's life journey. She would interweave that, and she would always be telling me about her life journey. That too was a kind of a tale. That too was a kind of a narrative. Mm-hmm. So I thought, why not just tell her story, but tell the tales with them.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular story that stood out for you?
In the Mamalou Tales?
Yes.
Excuse me, I'm trying to think which one. There's a story about, because some of my mum's own story, I've turned that they're like described in a way that they're tales. And one of those is where she has this vision of a fair maid or a mami wata or a wata mama and she doesn't realize what she's seeing until the next day she goes to a Catholic church and she sees Our Lady, an image of Our Lady, and she identifies what she had seen in a vision the night before with the Our Lady. So I find that story or that tale quite interesting, and that stands out. But the other tales, like the one that's called The Guitar Player, or I've called it The Guitar Player, where a lot of them are to do with sort of spirits that appear. And this one appears, and he appears before this man who's a guitar player, and he's on his way home, but the rain starts to fall, and he goes into somewhere to shelter. And then he sees this man. Initially, he didn't see the man, and then he notices a man beside him. And the man asks, no, he starts to play the guitar because the rain isn't easing. And then the man said to him after he finishes, "Can I play as well?" And I'm doing this in standard English, not in the Guyanese Creole as it's written in. And the man says, "Let me play." As well, and then he says, "Okay, when I was alive, I could have played sweeter music than you." So there are ones like that, but there are loads. It's hard to choose.
Yeah. Komfa, Guyanese Komfa. What inspired you to write on this subject?
That's a long story. I'll try and break it down. I was inspired to write about Guyanese Komfa out of my own search for spirituality that I could connect to, or that was connected to me in some way. And I mean, I'm kind of like articulating and theorizing on something that I actually think came the other way around. I don't think that I don't think that I consciously went searching for this thing to do. Right? I actually think it came the other way. It needed, or it wanted to be written, and I think it is the connection that I spoke about with my grandmother, because I think my grandmother used to love to dance. It's one of the things she'd do. She'd dance, and she knew how to dance in trance, but at the same time to hold her head, which means she didn't necessarily go into trance. So sometime in my university, ending of my first degree, I had an experience that eventually led me to exploring ideas about spirituality in contrast to interpretations of madness that might be signs given might be identified or interpreted as such. So I wanted to explore, what if this thing that is madness isn't madness, but it's something else? Because I felt that this thing was definitely something else. And what was it? I felt it was spiritual. And so if it was spiritual, what kind of spiritual was it? And I then started to, because my discipline was English literature, I wanted to find spiritual stories where spirituality was a feature. And I came across Toni Morrison, Beloved, and works by Marcy Condé, where she's talking about a witch, Itatuba, and so on. So I looked at those, and I thought, well, there's nothing written like this on a Guyanese aspect, and I searched for that. Still couldn't find any. And I thought, well, I'll write about it myself. I'll write a narrative around Komfa, but I'll also explore what Komfa is and explore it in terms of what it means, in terms of cultural identity. That's a
What
roundabout way.
what was most challenging for you on this journey in terms of um, getting the research, getting the answers you needed? What was the most challenging part, or what were some challenging aspects of it?
Um, it was really challenging because once you made the decision that that's what you're going to do, locating the material around it was difficult, because there's actually only one book on Guyanese on Komfa, and that's Dr. Keen Gibson's book on the practice. There are little articles of it in journals and things, but it's not really a widely studied subject. And I also found challenging the fact that I wouldn't have been able to do the field research, because I was getting sponsored by my university, and so they couldn't sponsor me to do field research, which I would have wanted to do. But at the same time, I wouldn't have necessarily know what I was going to do. So the theoretical was really looking at it from the point of, like I said, its possibility for exploring cultural identity, because it expresses, it reflects different ethnic spirits. And given Guyana's diversity, I wanted to just see at a deeper level who we really quickly we could be. And so I found it difficult to find material. So I had to theorize in a particular way. I had to apply certain concepts and things like that so that I can look at it. So it's just the material that's not there, but also the fact that, and it's still the case, it's not really celebrated. It's not really most Guyanese, when you speak to them about Komfa, they say they don't know, or it's, maybe it's the kind of Guyanese I'm speaking to, but they don't know. And now, yes, now there's a kind of a readiness or an openness. But then there was a lot of, when you say, do you know about Komfa? What's that? You find yourself having to explain it, but really actually, though they know about it, they might claim some level of ignorance about it. So it wasn't really easy talking about the subject, and it still, to a point, isn't, even though my recent visit to Guyana proved that there is certainly a need and a kind of a reception of it as a cultural form.
How are you able to describe Komfa for yourself?
How am I able to describe it for myself?
Yeah, well, how, if you were to put it into words for us, for the rest of us, for those who have heard about it, as many of us have growing up, but we can't quite put our finger on it, what really is Komfa?
Yeah, that's a good question. I associate Komfa with a wider spiritual concept of the divine, the material, and the spiritual. And when those two collide or come together,
Mm-hmm.
there is a mediation. Something takes place that becomes comfort, that is comfort. It takes place whereby you can no longer say in this moment that you're experiencing comfort, that you the physical self, or you a physical entity. The two are merged, and in that merging, or that merging sometimes appears violent, like or erratic, or it appears like it's a disturbing. It appears like, you know, there's a struggle. But once you settle down, or once the mediation is accepted, it's actually a very beautiful beautiful dynamic to experience.
Can you describe for us the first Komfa trance-like experience you observed, and then describe for us the first time you experienced it?
The first Komfa trance experience that I observed was when physically observed, because I saw one on video, but the first one that I physically observed was at an aunt's funeral, when a young boy went into trance. The drumming was happening, and he went into a trance state, and he was actually calling for a cigarette at the time. There were all these elders around. It was actually at the wake of my aunt. There were elders around, including my mother, and there were young people around as well. There was a bit of confusion about what to do with the boy, or for the boy. There was also a bit of confusion about what to do with the fact, or the reality that something is happening, that the boy is catching comfort. Some people knew what was happening, but didn't seem to know what to do, and others weren't, even though they knew what to do, were not responsive. So, for example, he was asking for this cigarette for a long time, and I believe the spirit was asking for the cigarette, not the boy, because the boy was about 12, 13, and so he was calling for this cigarette, and my mum was asking any of the people there, and there were quite a few of them who smoked, if they could give the boy the cigarette, but they were like reluctant and refused, and there was even one who was just argumentative about it, and one of them was my cousin, who I also tried to ask for the cigarette. She was standing there smoking, and she got quite annoyed and said that her aunt, my who passed, wouldn't be up for this. She wouldn't want this, and so on. But the boy, if we got back to him, he eventually got the cigarette. My mum managed to get him the cigarette, and he was dancing and dancing and dancing, and he was actually trying to dance and go outside of this space where we were, and he was prevented from doing so. And I just remember it being a confusing time, like, you know, and a sort of what I talk about in my book, really, this kind of embarrassment, this kind of, you know, freaking out, like, what's happening, we don't know. And a lot of the Berbutians where I was from, they knew what was happening. It's just the reactions were a bit confusing.
And the first time you experienced it?
The first time, that's an interesting question. Because before I said about, for me, comfort is that moment of mediation and a kind of an alignment of the spirit and the spirit and the material coming together. I believe that happened before I was going to research and study comfort. I believe that took place in the moment when I was at university, when I had an experience that I later was able to deem for myself was a spiritual experience, where those two things happened, where a spiritual energy and entity and my physical self merged. So that was what I would say about my first experience of comfort, and which at the time would have been considered mad, I would have been considered, she's mad, she's schizophrenic, and so forth. But the time actual, if you like, of comfort dance, and not just the altered state of consciousness, if you like. And that was it was my brother's birthday, and the drums were playing, and it's really difficult to. I mean, at that time, by now I'm in the midst of my research, and I don't discuss this ever. I've never really spoken about it, so it's like really kind of.
That's okay. That's okay.
But yeah, it was. I suppose I was prepared, in the sense that I wasn't afraid, and it's a bit like free falling. Free falling, and trusting that you're going to land, or land. The fall is comforting. You can handle the falling. You can handle the rhythm of the fall, or the floating. A bit like, I suppose, if you go into meditation and you go off into where you're light, and you just allow yourself to fly, or to bust through doors, or climb, or whatever the thing is that seemed like, if you were in your physical self, you would fear, and you would struggle. So I think it was just like a willingness to just free fall, and
what do you think?
Allow that lightness to happen.
What do you think? So many Guyanese tend to associate comfort with something to be ashamed of and to shy away from. What did your research reveal?
Well, I mean, where it connects with other such practices, because wherever there are Africans in the diaspora or on the continent, you will find forms like these, and wherever in Africa and across the diaspora we were colonized or enslaved, you will find the remnants of that process expressing itself in the demonization of our natures, if you like, our cultures, our traditions, and that demonization just persists. And so, remember, just drumming alone was outlawed across the Caribbean. It was outlawed, not only because the colonials apparently saw it as rowdy, but because it connected with revolutionary and liberation movements like Haiti, and so on. So it's the reticence and the ambivalence and the fear that we're seeing is a historical hangover, because our traditions were condemned or preference to Christianity. So you have Christianity appearing as the civilized version of spiritual expression or religious freedom, and anything that was linked back to Africa seen as devilish or wicked, or satanic, and and especially where it's linked to ancestors. That creates even more of an issue for some people. So I think Komfa just falls into umbrella of spiritual traditions that are continued from Africa that are, demonized through cultural imperialism, but from the European colonial powers, and then Africans just maintain this kind of Orientalist image of it.
Let's take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk a little bit about drums and drumming. How important drumming is to the Komfa ritual.